Hello to everybody who's watching this webinar. My name is Rebecca Harkin, and I'm the publisher for Psychology and Human Behaviour at Wiley. And as my role there, actually, one of my responsibilities is to oversee the publication of the BPS's portfolio of 11 journals. So it's a real pleasure for me to be talking at the BPS Conference today. So I'm going to be talking about publishing with impact. And this talk is designed to provide practical ideas and guidance on how to make sure that when you publish your research, it's both discovered and then is able to achieve its maximum impact. So I'm just going to kick off my slides now. Okay, so I think we're all aware that increasingly researchers are expected to show the impact of their research. Until relatively recently, it was considered that researchers should publish their articles in, for preference, the journal with the highest impact factor, and then there would be one measure of that article's success, which would be citations, which would then feed into the impact factor of the journal. But over recent years, we've seen quite a marked change in this. And there are various reasons for this, I think. I think one of the most important is that funders have become an ever more important role in the scholarly communications landscape. And as funders are funding research, they really want to be able to see evidence of the effectiveness of the impact of their research. And so that has had quite a profound change. I think in the UK, the Research Excellence Framework, has also had quite an impact on focusing, or quite an effect in focusing attention on impact. Within certain disciplines, including psychology, the replicability and the implementation of research has become more important. And I think alongside this, we've also seen a move away from the importance of the impact factor. So I've mentioned on the slide here, I've just put DORA, which is the Declaration on Research Assessment. And this is a declaration which is being signed by academic societies and journal editors in increasing numbers. And this declaration says that the impact factor, one of the many things it says, is that the impact factor is not an effective or the most suitable way of judging the quality of the articles within each journal. And so journals that sign up to DORA, for example, do not display their impact factor on the journal homepage as a number of journals do. And this is, I think a sign of a growing movement away from relying so much on the impact factor. And in turn, I think this has directed attention more to the impact of articles on policy, which is really important, in the media more generally and feeding into debates, and in terms of downloads and sometimes the global reach and effectiveness of an article in that way. So I think we can see that we're actually looking at a rather different landscape to the one that we were a few years ago. So in terms of measuring impact, how is it measured at the moment? So in terms of impact, we're basically looking at you get read, you get shared, you get cited. So get read is measured by usage, and publishers tend to do this, and they can provide usage figures on articles showing how many times they were downloaded in a particular period, normally a year, and whereabouts in the world, so the global reach of those articles. In terms of getting shared, we have metrics, which I'm going to talk about a bit more later. And this collects mentions in social media and web-based media, and also in policy documents to track the online attention and effectiveness of research. And then there's getting cited, which is obviously measured through citations, which captures references to a published source and essentially tracks the validation of one's research by other researchers. So in this environment, how do we maximize the impact of a paper? I'm going to talk just very briefly about 2 or 3 things here, because I think there's often people think that impact is something that happens after publication, but in fact there are 2 or 3 really key things that you can do pre-publication that will have a direct effect on the impact of your article once it's published. The first one, I know this sounds really obvious, is just selecting the right journal, but especially for early career researchers, this can be quite daunting because there are, over 44,000 journals are published a year. And so how do you choose the right one? Looking at your references can be a really good way of narrowing down to a certain number of core journals, a kind of short list. and then I'd recommend reading some of the articles and publications in those journals, and then asking yourself the following questions. And these questions also apply to the nature of your research. What is the journal's scope and focus, and what's the journal's audience? And this will have an impact on whether you want your research to reach. Are you looking to reach researchers? Are you looking to reach policymakers or possibly practitioners? And you want to choose a journal which is discovering and being read by the audience that you also want to be reading your research. What's the journal standing in the target community? This doesn't need to necessarily be the impact factor. So in my portfolio at Wiley, I published 2 journals in social psychology that focus on, say, community social psychology and issues of social justice. And I publish other journals that might have a higher impact factor, but if that's the audience you want to reach, then these are probably the 2 best journals to be publishing in. So what is the type and length of articles that this journal or the journals you're looking at are publishing? Some of my journals, for example, only publish research articles at 20,000 words, and that may well not be what you're looking for in terms of your journal. So have a look to see what type and length of articles are being published, and also what the average time to decision and to publication is. This is becoming increasingly important because once you make the decision to publish your research, you really want it to be out there as quickly as possible. And then finally, do you want to consider publishing open access? Because journals have a range of options around this. Some journals only publish gold open access articles, some don't publish open access at all, and then there's the largest number in the middle that publish both open access and kind of inverted commas normal subscription articles. So once you've looked at all of these things, narrow it down to one journal and then submit to one journal at a time. Then the other really important thing you can do pre-publication is to think about writing to maximize the impact of your article. I've put at the top, aim to tell a good story. And I don't mean by that that your article necessarily needs to be based around a really novel result or something that's going to make a huge impact on your field, although obviously that's wonderful too. Because all different types of research are valuable, and sometimes that can be validation studies, or it can be studies with negative results as well. But whatever kind of research you're publishing, it really helps to make sure that you have a clear, useful scientific message, that it flows in a logical manner, that you have subheadings to break it up to provide a clear narrative, that it's well formatted, it's written in a style that makes your message clear, and that it has an informative and concise title. And I can't really overemphasize the importance of this final one, the clear title. I know that this might sound a bit dull and maybe a bit surprising to some people, but discoverability of research has become incredibly important over recent years. And if I can put this in a little bit of context to tell you why, there are about, I think I mentioned earlier, there are roughly sort of 44,000 journals being published, about 33, just over 33,000 of those are English language peer-reviewed journals. And combined, those journals are publishing about 3 million articles a year. This was in 2018, so it might be a little higher now. And they're coming out from around 7 to 8 million researchers, depending on how you count the number of researchers. So you can see that when you're publishing into a really kind of busy and in some ways kind of noisy environment. And so it's really important that your piece of research can be discovered by the people who are going to be interested in reading it. And having an SEO-friendly title, that stands for search engine optimization, is one of the key things that means that researchers or practitioners or policymakers can find your piece of research. So that means bearing in mind that people are going to find your articles by and large by searching for them on Google. It used to be the case that people would go to a journal homepage or a publisher's platform to look to see the articles that were coming out in those issues or in the archive. But increasingly, that's not the way that people find articles. People are Googling, and they're Googling using search terms. So if your title doesn't correspond to the search terms that they're using, the chances are that they're not going to find your piece of research. So use a clear title, make sure you've got your key terms in your title, And some search engines actually only search the first 65 characters of a title. So it's quite important to make sure that your search terms are both in the title and fairly early on in the title as well, so that they can be discovered. And then finally, write a clear abstract, because often the abstract is the only part of the article that's free, and that means that it's the part that's sometimes is read more than any other part of the article. So it's really important that the abstract uses the key search terms in context, that it's accessible and engaging, and it clearly states what the research is and why it's important, why somebody should read it. I've got quite a good example here, I think, from the British Journal of Developmental Psychology. So this article is about parental predictors of children's executive functioning from the ages 6 to 10. So you can see that's a wonderfully clear and informative title. Looking at the abstract below, those bright blue terms are the ones I've highlighted, are terms that come from the title. So they're repeated but used within context very early on in the abstract, which is great. That's then followed by a clear statement of what the research was and how it was carried out, including the sample size and where the research was carried out. Carrying on from that, there's then a very clear description of what the outcome was and the conclusion. So that kind of gives somebody who might be interested in research in that area, that gives them everything they need to know about whether that research is going to be relevant for them and whether they're going to then download that article. So I've talked a bit about those pre-publication areas, about title and about abstract. I'm just going to say a little bit now about citations and impact factor. I'm sure the vast majority of us are really familiar with citations, but it's a reference to a published or unpublished source which recognizes the relevance of that work to the topic. A journal impact factor is created by taking all of the articles or citable items from a certain period. We're used to working with 2-year window impact factor, 2-year impact factor windows. So say all the articles published in that journal over a 2-year window, and then dividing that by the number of citations generated by those articles, and that's what the impact factor score is. So effectively, it evaluates the impact of a journal by using citations as a unit of quality. But there are certain drawbacks to this. So for example, certainly in small specialist journals in particular, but to a certain extent in all journals, there may be some articles that are cited a lot. There might be a lot of articles which aren't cited at all or only cited very little, and yet the impact factor is meant to cover the entire journal. Also, although there is a 2-year impact factor window, there's also a 5-year, but the 2-year is the most reported one. And that sort of suits fields like medical science because things move very fast there and citations happen quickly. But in areas like social sciences and humanities, it often takes a much longer period for an article to attract all the citations that it's going to gather over its article life. And therefore the 2-year impact factor window can be too short to really accurately reflect that. And then the third kind of issue with it is a metric that relates to the journal itself rather than applied specifically to an article within it. And so it's a very blunt instrument for judging the value and the quality of an article. So somewhat in kind of distinction to that, altmetrics was developed, and this is becoming an increasingly popular way of judging or looking at the quality of an article. So altmetric literally means, or short for alternative metrics. And this is a way of looking at the impact of an article to a certain extent outside the academic community in the wider world. So what it does is it gathers mentions of articles in post-publication peer review sites, like PubMed Central, in mainstream media, in online reference managers, in social media like Twitter, Facebook, and Google, and also in government policy documents, which is really important. And each of those you can see is color-coded, and that's reflected in what's called the altmetric donut, which is that circle you can see at the top right-hand side of the screen. Just here, I have a more detailed page of a particular article to show you how the altmetric score is gathered. So this comes from the British Journal of Psychology, an article that was published in 2018. And at that point, you can see on the right-hand side, you've got the the left-hand side, you've got the altmetric donut, and that's slightly different color because that's reflecting the different composition of the mentions. Underneath it, it'll tell you that that article at that particular point had been mentioned in 9 news outlets, in 1 blog, 201 tweets, 1 Facebook page, and 4 Redditors, and that it had been read by 5 people on Mendeley. And then that is all weighted, and from that is created an altmetric score, because as you can imagine, a Twitter mention doesn't quite have the same value as mention in a policy document, for example, and that's why the weighting comes around. So then there's an altmetric score, and along that, along the bottom of that series of boxes, that shows you where the article sits in terms of impact within all research outputs, which essentially articles, within that particular journal, within articles published within a certain kind of near time frame. So you can then get a sense of how the article sits alongside other articles in terms of its impact. At Wiley, and this is also happening with a number of other publishers, we're now representing the altmetric score next to each of our articles so that people can see what kind of impact they're having. And I think this reporting of metrics which are specific to an article rather than impact factor is growing fast and is going to be much more influential in the next few years than even it is at the moment. So we talked about citations and and other metrics like altmetrics. So you'll now had your article accepted and it's being published. So what other things can you do? I would really recommend that you look at your publisher's author pages. This is one that I've taken from our Wiley author toolkit. We have a number of author pages to help authors publish their manuscripts and all the different facets. And this one is about helping them maximize the impact of your research. And here there are 9 promotional tools. The first one, SEO, we've already talked about, and I'm going to talk very briefly about some of these others. So it mentions conferences, publicity, networking, the wider web, multimedia, email, article sharing, and social media. And I'm sure that the majority of publishers will have pages like this to give you really helpful tips and advice on how to maximize the impact of your research. Those can be really helpful. So making your research visible. Make your manuscript easily accessible. This really helps. So a number of publishers are now providing the option of putting your article on a preprint server as soon as it's been accepted, and Wiley at the moment is running a pilot on this. And I think this is only going to become more common. And it's also possible, of course, to put your articles on a preprint service which aren't directly connected to individual publishers. But this is a way of getting your research out there, either pre-acceptance or at the moment of acceptance, and therefore making sure that it's available to people as soon as possible who might be interested in it. There are also, it's possible to put post-publication prints onto a repository, and this can also be another valuable way of making sure that your research is visible. It's really good to think about building links that would all point back to your article. I'm just going to move on to the next slide quickly just to show you what I mean about this. So again, this is something from our author toolkits, but there are different ways that you can do this. So most publishers provide ways of sharing your article, and that's what the top one is about, sharing your article in a way that a publisher makes available to you. The next one is about email, about adding a link to your email signature and to asking your co-authors if you have any to do the same. Then social media, think about posting your article on social media accounts and make sure that you're staying engaged in any conversations about your research. If you run a blog, to think about posting something around your article, or if you have access or are aware of any blogs that might be relevant to your research. And then online, if you have online profiles, and a lot of researchers do, and update your online profile to make sure you're including a link to your article. So you can see that if you do all of these things, you're actually building up a network of links that all come back to your article and help its availability. Think about sharing your data. I mean, not all articles, of course, have data, or they don't have data that can necessarily be shared, but where it is possible, this is a very valuable thing to do for a number of reasons. I mean, of course, it helps the replicability and the transparency and openness of research, and is really helpful to other researchers working in your field. But it also provides another way in which the research you're doing can be discovered by people if you have your data in a repository. Share your paper. I was just talking about that Wiley, for example, produces a number or makes available a number of ways for researchers to legitimately share their articles. So, for example, we have read-only links that authors can send out to as many people as they like to make sure that they know about their research. We also have 10 downloads that authors can share with anybody that they want to. And then there are various other ways in which publishers will help you share your paper, and I would advise you to take to use them to get the benefit of all of them. And then finally, open access. Open access is a way of either making your article available immediately on publication, free to anybody. This is gold open access, and with a permanent online presence. Or green open access is after an embargo period, which varies from subject area to subject area, but is typically about 12 months with psychology. An author is allowed to openly post their article, for example, on their own web pages or in a university repository, so that people can then discover it. So open access can be a really useful way of broadening access to your article. And we do know from research that's been done that gold open access papers are typically cited more than articles that aren't available through gold open access. So I'm just going to say a little bit more about this. So I think these days, people don't always realize that there are ways of publishing open access that are available to them. And I've just listed some of those. So a lot of funders provide funds these days for articles to be published gold open access. And that's a really good idea. But there are also transitional deals which publishers have been signing with, or some publishers have been signing with big library consortia, which enable gold open access publishing. So just to use an example of this, in March of this year, Wiley signed a deal with JISC, which is the not-for-profit UK library consortium. And this deal covers 138 institutions of higher education in the UK. So not only is all of the Wiley Journal content available to researchers at those institutions, but those researchers are also able to publish gold open access in any Wiley journal. So this is a very new thing, and which is why I say that sometimes researchers aren't always available of the complete range of options for gold open access publishing at the moment. So it's quite possible that if you're based in that you may be based in one of those 138 institutions, and you will be able to publish your article gold open access. Then there are also arrangements that we have with individual institutions where they pay for their researchers to be able to publish gold open access. And sometimes you can check with your institution to find out whether they have that kind of arrangement with the publishing house. And then at the bottom, I've mentioned authors. I mentioned grant funds already, but there are also sometimes APC waivers and discounts for certain countries where open access funding may not be available in the way that it is, say, in Western Europe, to make it easier to publish gold open access. A lot of people sometimes say, well, how do I know that that option is available to me? Most publishers will have something like Wiley. This is one of our screens for our open access policy finder, which if you're submitting to Wiley, you can quickly find out whether you're covered by one of these transitional deals, the one I was just mentioning with the UK, whether your institution will cover the cost of publishing gold open access, or whether you might be eligible for a waiver of some kind. And most publishers will have something like this that will show you whether that's a viable option for you or not. So moving on, spreading the word, think about conferences, going to conferences and talking about your research. Publicity, is there a newsworthy angle to your research? We can sometimes produce press releases, but we also have an option of tweeting about them. So we have a Twitter feed to say 90,000 psychology researchers, and we can use that with something particularly newsworthy. But I would say to you, let your editor know, your journal editor know if that's the case, because we rely on the editors handing that information on to us so that we can do that work. Social media, we've talked about quite a bit already. Use social media wherever possible. It's a really valuable way of bringing your research to the attention of people. And increasingly, we're being told by early career researchers that Twitter is the way in which they discover research, their primary way of discovering articles. So that can be really valuable. And then multimedia. So think about video abstracts. a video abstract really increases the percentage, the chances of your, sorry, I'll start that again. So having a video abstract attached to your paper really increases the number of downloads compared to articles that don't have video abstracts. They can be done, Wiley offers a service to have a very short professional one done. It's a pay for service, but you can also do one yourself just using your webcam, and a very short introduction and explanation of why your research is valuable and relevant is really good thing to submit with your paper once it's been accepted, and it will in most cases make a difference, I think, to how often your paper is downloaded. And then finally, the one thing I would really recommend is if you don't have an ORCID ID, this is a really valuable thing to have. So ORCID is a not-for-profit organization which provides permanent unique identifiers that links a researcher with their research. And that means that that's particularly valuable if you have a name, for example, which might be shared by another researcher or be very similar to another researcher. And if we think, there are between 7 and 8 million researchers producing articles each year, that's the chances are that you're going to have a similar name to somebody else. So this is a very clear way of identifying you with your research, so that people can link it to you, then you can make the most of your impact and make sure that research is being, the impact of that research is being tracked back to you. I know I'm almost up on my time. This has been a very whistle-stop tour, but I hope there have been some useful ideas there. I should have said at the beginning that if anybody has any kind of particularly important questions, they could put them through the Q&A, and I'm just going to have a quick look there. And I've got a question here about, in relation to qualitative research, is there a minimum of participants that is favoured in order for the research to be published? I would say, just briefly in answer to that, I don't think there's a set number. I mean, obviously, the larger the number, the more attractive in many ways, but there's also a very definite place for research which works with a smaller number, which then leads on to other research. So I wouldn't say that I've heard that there's a minimum number that has been that is kind of popularly understood as the kind of starting point for research, but by and large, the number of the participants that are larger in many ways. Okay, I think we're at the end of my time here. I'm dead on 12:30, so thanks very much for everybody who's attended the session, and I hope that you found something useful.